Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Our topic today is voting in Pennsylvania. Our guest is Al Schmidt, Secretary of the Commonwealth. Welcome to our program. Mr. Secretary, just what does your job involve? What are your responsibilities? Tell us briefly.
The Secretary of the Commonwealth is responsible for a number of things. Most people know it as being responsible for election oversight in Pennsylvania. That is an important role that we have. But in addition to that, we handle all sort of business registrations, charitable registrations, certifications to be anything from a nurse to a crane operator, to a funeral home director, to you name it. So we have significant regulatory authorities as well.
Welcome to Capitol Preview, and join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. We'll also take your questions from PCN's Facebook page submitted earlier today. Let's talk about a program that just took effect recently here in the Commonwealth. The governor announced what is being called an automatic voter registration program. Just how does that work?
In a number of states, more than 24 states or so, they've implemented something called automatic voter registration. A couple weeks ago, Pennsylvania did the same. It is really the interface when you go to PennDOT to get a driver's license. As you've known for decades now, you have the option to register to vote. That interface has changed just a little bit. That says you'll now be registered to vote. You have the option to opt out. No one is compelled to register to vote. No one is forced to register to vote, but it makes registering to vote a little bit easier. It's really important to do that, to register voters who are eligible but not registered, and to update voter registration. So you go to PennDOT to change your address. You go to PennDOT to change your name on your driver's license, for example. And that makes the voter registration record, even if you're already registered, more accurate.
So what do I do, Mr. Secretary, if I happen not to have a driver's license?
So when you can also get a Pennsylvania ID. So PennDOT also offers identification separate from the driver's license process that is very similar. Obviously, you don't take your driver's test or anything else like that.
But you still have to go to PennDOT.
You do, and you provide all the same credentials that show that you are a United States citizen, that you are a resident of Pennsylvania, and you're eligible for a driver's license or ID.
Now, why does the governor support this idea?
I think, as we've seen from, again, a number of other states, it helps reach out to voters who aren't otherwise registered to vote. And when election time comes around, and in my experience running elections for more than 10 years, most normal people don't necessarily spend a lot of time preparing for Election Day, other than in the immediate time right before an election, where it might be too late to register to vote. So automatic voter registration through Motor Voter results in more people who are eligible being registered to vote.
So does that mean then ultimately that more Pennsylvanians will vote as a result of auto voter registration? Is that the goal?
Well, it means more Pennsylvanians will be registered to vote. Ultimately, it's up to that Pennsylvanian to take the initiative to show up on Election Day and vote, or apply for a mail-in ballot and vote. And in other cases that we've seen, the more people who are registered, the more likely to increase the number of votes that they're cast by those eligible registered voters. You can't vote if you're not registered, so registering is the first step.
How much input did lawmakers have into this idea of automatic voter registration?
Lawmakers authorized not just obviously at the federal level, the Motor Voter National Voter Registration Act in 1993, but in Pennsylvania in, I believe, 1995, the Pennsylvania Voter Registration Act, which authorized the Secretary of the Commonwealth, working in conjunction with the Secretary of Transportation, or PennDOT, to set up the entire interface between the voter and registering to vote when at a PennDOT location. There were also changes to the law along the way, but the Secretary of the Commonwealth and the Secretary of Transportation are completely authorized to do this at the direction of the governor, who has been very supportive of this for some time.
Well, many lawmakers in Pennsylvania feel they didn't have adequate or sufficient input into this idea. It was just announced by the governor one day, and some lawmakers are bothered by that.
Well, Motor Voter is not new. It's been around since 1993. So this is a small but significant change in the way voters can register to vote when they visit a PennDOT location. And again, no one is compelled to register to vote. If for some reason you don't want to register to vote, you have the option to decline.
How soon does this program go into effect?
It was already in effect the day that it was announced, just a couple weeks ago.
Let's explore your background some more, Mr. Secretary. Now, you've had this position just for a few months. So would you tell us about the path you took that led to this position?
Sure. I was appointed Secretary of the Commonwealth by the governor right at inauguration, or soon before inauguration. And prior to that, I had run elections. I was city commissioner of Philadelphia for 10 years, which is an elected position. There are 3 city commissioners responsible for running elections in Philadelphia. For the past 50-some years, it's been 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. It's important that election boards be bipartisan. So bipartisanship is an important kind of check and balance that's built in to this system, whether it's at the county level or it's at the precinct level. When you go in to vote and you come to that election board and the people sitting behind that table, the law is written in a way to encourage that board to be bipartisan. Same thing at the county level. So I ran elections in Philadelphia for 10 years. I was a Republican city commissioner. There were 2 Democratic city commissioners. Prior to that, I had worked for something called the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, in Washington, D.C., where I was responsible for conducting performance audits of federal programs, policies, and procedures to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, and use taxpayer dollars more efficiently and effectively.
Now, Mr. Secretary, give us some insight into running elections. When I go to a polling place and I cast my vote, all I do is push a few buttons and then I go out. But I know that there's an effort involving a lot of people there that you have to coordinate. So give us a look behind the scenes, all the things that have to be done before any election. For example, getting buildings for polling places. You got to get volunteers, etc.
That's right. And, you know, it's interesting, when I became city commissioner, I remember people saying to me, like, what do you do the rest of the year other than the 2 election days and the primary and the general?
That sounds like a question for Santa Claus somehow.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
When it's not Christmas, what do you do?
Santa and the elves are making toys all year long, right? So in this case, you've got to locate polling places that will be available so that voters can vote there. You have to make sure that they are wheelchair accessible, so there are no accessibility concerns on election day. You have to recruit and staff those polling places with usually it's 3 to 5 election board workers who are people from that precinct. They are people from that neighborhood who are essentially volunteering for 14 hours on election day so that you can cast your vote and have your vote counted. They get paid sort of very little. They're paid by the counties, so it's a different amount in different counties, but it's a long day. When it's a busy election day, like a presidential general election, it's a long day. And when it's a slow election cycle, it's a long day as well. And it's never easy. And it's really important. I would encourage your viewers to, when they go to vote, if they choose to vote in person, to thank those people. They are their neighbors. They are volunteering for a long day to, again, make sure their votes get counted.
Let's talk some more about those volunteers, especially after the election of 2020. Some election volunteers threw up their hands and quit because they were tired of abuse.
There have been really so many changes to elections in the past several years. Most counties in Pennsylvania since 2020 or before 2020, 2019 have new in-person voting systems. So when you go to vote in person, you vote on a system, whether it's a hand-marked paper ballot or a ballot marking device, both of which result in a voter-verified paper ballot record of how the voter casts their votes that is used in not 1, but 2 audits after every election by the counties to determine that the electronic tabulation of those paper ballot votes match the hand-counted audit of those votes as well. So it was a big improvement right before 2020 to make sure that you had this voter-verifiable paper ballot where the voter reviews their ballot before they cast their ballot, and it's ink on paper selections by the voters. Those people that I mentioned, they're trained. Counties offer training to work on Election Day. In addition to that, obviously, since 2020, it was passed in 2019 supported by the Republican House and the Republican Senate, signed by a Democratic governor to bring about mail-in ballot voting in Pennsylvania, where a voter can vote by mail if they choose, if they are registered and if they apply and their application is approved. They can receive a ballot in the mail, complete that ballot, and mail it back, and it has to arrive before 8 p.m. on Election Day.
Well, let me put it this way, Mr. Secretary. Just how difficult is it to attract and retain good volunteers, and again, given any divisiveness that may have occurred during any political cycle?
No one is doing it for the pay. I can tell you that. Counties might pay $100 for the day or $200 for the day, but really the most important thing is to appeal to people's civic responsibility, their belief in the core function of our democratic republic, our representative democracy, is for people to cast their vote and make their voice heard. So, like I said, it's not necessarily an easy day, but and there has been significant turnover, not just at the precinct level, but at the county level as well. Department of State has been tracking the significant number of election administrators from across the Commonwealth. It's not unique in Pennsylvania. It's been going on across the country, where either because of all the changes or people getting fed up with all the grief that they're receiving for no good reason, moving on and deciding to do other things. Department of State.
So what can you do then to make these positions attractive?
I think that's a really important question. One of the most important things is to provide training materials and provide training. So Department of State is devising training materials and training for new election board officials at the county level. Because if you're thrown into running elections a month or two before Election Day, you probably don't know a lot about election administration. And what we need to do is make sure that election officials, whether they're in big cities or rural counties, know what the election code is, know what the law provides for, what it allows and doesn't allow. In an environment where there's so much scrutiny right now about elections, it's so important that the people responsible for running elections don't make mistakes. There are no do-overs when it comes to elections. So the better trained they are, the better.
Well, Mr. Secretary, let me apply this point I'm trying to make with you about election volunteers and apply it to you personally, because back in 2020, after the 2020 election, you and then President Trump locked horns after that 2020 election. You were on the Philadelphia Elections Board at the time. Tell us what happened.
There were accusations about, and most of them were, all of them were untrue. Most of them were pretty far-fetched, about election fraud in Philadelphia, whether it was South Philly organized crime figures smuggling in truckloads of counterfeit Chinese ballots or whatever else, dead allegations of every police officer who had fallen in the line of duty in Philadelphia voted, all sorts of things like that were really easily disprovable. But it's amazing, especially in the sort of social media world that we're in, how quickly lies can spread. So it was important to speak out in a reactionary way, speak out when accusations were made, not to engage with candidates, not to engage with President Trump or Vice President Biden, but whenever allegations were made, for us to speak out to say what was true and what was not.
Now, you're talking about social media, and we all know Donald Trump likes to put out tweets. And in this case, he put out a tweet to the effect of that you had refused to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. And you said a lot of this was easily provable. And yet, there must have been some consequences. I mean, your phone must have been ringing. There must have been some feedback from the public that was influenced by the president's tweets.
Well, the consequences for me were little different than the consequences for election officials across the country, Democrats and Republicans in big cities and rural counties who told the truth about elections, resulting in death threats directed toward their families and all sorts of ugliness that is a result of people being deceived about elections. It was a difficult time for me. It was a difficult time for election administrators across the country. And my
How long
experience
did
was
this
no
fire
different.
burn in your mind? How long did you have to make an effort to put this fire out?
I'm not sure.
Was this days or weeks?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it stopped. 2020, the accusations in the 2020 election did a lot of damage to confidence in our electoral process. And normally the truth is the antidote to lies. But it has only been so successful. So it's important that we do at the Pennsylvania Department of State and county election administrators do, which is to tell the truth about elections, make them as transparent as the election code allows, and to answer questions when they arise and combat lies when they
It sounds like you have to work on reaching out to people. You got to take the initiative here. It seems.
We all do, and there's no end to it. It's not like a couple of months after the 2020 election or any election, those things go away. Candidates don't like to lose, and it's difficult, and I get that, but it's not appropriate to blame election administrators for your own failure.
Viewers, you can join our discussion we're having with the Secretary of the Commonwealth right now. We'd like you to call us at 1-877-PA6-5001, or if you choose to, you can text us at 717-219-4001. Mr. Secretary, tell me more about how your old job, namely the job you had in Philadelphia, has prepared you for the job you hold today.
You know, I have to say, I think it's been a unique benefit because I've run elections. I've run probably more than 24 elections over my 10 years in office, with primaries and generals and special elections as well. I think it's important to be in this position as Secretary of the Commonwealth as someone who has actually run elections. So when the legislature or others talk about making changes to the election code, being there on the spot, as election administrators are rarely consulted about changes. And it was a frustration for me, and it's a frustration for a lot of election administrators, where the law changes, but the people responsible for implementing the law aren't consulted. So it's gratifying and I think beneficial to have someone who has actually run elections be in this position to provide feedback.
Let's talk about something that's, well, it seems relatively new to me anyway, that the mail-in ballot, of course, is here in Pennsylvania, and that became the law a few years ago. And according to our state constitution, secrecy in voting must be preserved. And how is this achieved with mail-in ballots?
That's a really good question. So when an applicant applies for a mail-in ballot and that application is approved, the registered voter is sent a packet of materials. Those materials contain the ballot itself. They contain something called a secrecy envelope, and they contain something called a declaration envelope. The declaration envelope is the envelope completed by the voter, where they sign and date the declaration envelope on the outside of the ballot. Within that is the secrecy envelope, and within that is the ballot that's been completed by the voter for when they return. So when ballots are being processed, whether they're in a county that has one person working to do this or hundreds of people working to do it, the declaration envelope is reviewed to ensure that it is completed accurately. The declaration envelope, and these are done in batches, is opened, the secrecy envelopes are removed. Then the secrecy envelopes are opened and the ballots are removed. So this multi-step process really separates the identity of the voter from how they voted. You don't want to violate voters' privacy when they're casting a vote. So that's the role the secrecy envelope serves in this whole process. But if you don't sign and date your ballot, if you don't put your ballot in a secrecy envelope and put that secrecy envelope in the outer envelope, I'm sorry, if you don't complete your ballot,
right?
You complete your ballot, you put it in the secrecy envelope. You put the secrecy envelope in the outer envelope, sign and date it. If you don't sign it or date it, or put your ballot in the secrecy envelope, right now the law doesn't allow that ballot to be counted. So it's important.
Because the situation you describe has been ruled on at the court level, right?
It has, and the directions are very simple. It's put the ballot in the secrecy envelope, put the secrecy envelope in the outer envelope, sign it and date it, and return it. And the most important thing, of course, is that that ballot be returned by 8 p.m. on Election Day.
So that's still somewhat of a hitch in the process for some voters. The fact that you have to get used to the idea that you're using 2 envelopes to cast your vote, that's all. They got to get used to it.
Yes, because the secrecy envelope allows for the voter to obviously separate their vote from their identity.
Now,
that's the role that it serves. But it's a very simple process. Voters should not be dissuaded from any of it. The directions are very clear.
And the 2019 mail-in ballot law is still being challenged as recently as June of this year. So, I mean, that's a whole 4 years have elapsed. So what have we learned about this process in those 4 years, and how can you apply those lessons to, say, the 2024 election?
Well, I think as a result of all those court decisions, we've learned a couple of things. And one is that mail-in ballot voting is completely legal and permissible in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And despite accusations to the contrary, voting by mail is safe and secure. There is still a responsibility on the voter to return it by 8 p.m. on Election Day. It is heartbreaking to be an election administrator, and I'm sure this is an experience that every other election administrator has witnessed, where ballots come in after Election Day. So if it's mailed, at least a few days in advance of Election Day, or returned to whether it's a drop box or the County Board of Elections, it's important that voters do that.
And there can be a lot of traffic in the post office that time of year, I would expect, and you got to anticipate that.
There can.
In other words, just waiting a few days before the election, that might not be sufficient.
Yeah, whether it's registering to vote or applying for a mail-in ballot, if you choose to vote that way, or returning that ballot, there is nothing good comes from waiting kind of too long in that whole process. You never want to wait for a deadline. You want to apply to register when you can, not wait for the deadline. You want to apply for a mail-in ballot as soon as you can, not wait for the deadline if you choose to vote that way. And if you don't and you're registered, you can obviously show up in person and vote on Election Day. But I know from my experience, mail-in ballot voting, if you were a firefighter in Northeast Philadelphia, and your fire station was in Southwest Philadelphia, and you worked a 12-hour shift from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., there was no ability to cast your vote in person on Election Day, and no ability to vote by absentee ballot because you weren't absent from the county. If you were a nurse, if you're a doctor, if you're involved in public safety, if you're working 2 jobs, if you're picking up your kids after school and all the rest, mail-in ballot voting made it more accessible to voters and their busy schedules.
So keeping that in mind, about how many Pennsylvanians have taken advantage of the mail-in ballot system?
Well, 2020 was really unique in the sense that all mail-in ballot voting was passed prior to COVID even being on anyone's horizon. But in about 50% of voters in Pennsylvania voted by mail in 2020. That number has gone down slightly since then. I think it's in the 30s right now in terms of percentage of voters who choose to vote by mail, which is probably more where it would otherwise be if you just introduced mail-in ballot voting. When you look at other states, the first year you might have 10 or 15%. The next year you might have 15 or 20. So we're sort of, I think, where we otherwise would be in terms of the volume of voters who are choosing to vote by mail.
Is it possible to forecast the popularity of mail-in voting in 2024? Is this something you want to be ready for?
It really isn't, but it is important to be ready for it, whether at the state level or the county level. And I know county election administrators have done the preparation that they need to get their ballots in order, to make sure that they're accurate, and to make sure that they get in the hands of voters as soon as voters apply for them and their application is approved.
Let's talk about some legislation that went through the House recently that would concern your office, Mr. Secretary. The PA House approved moving the presidential primary up on our calendar. First, basic question, why do this?
Well, the governor has been supportive of this, as have many, many others. Right now, the primary of 2024 falls on Passover. So there's a conflict with a religious holiday. In addition to that, there are other legislators and others who have an interest in moving up Pennsylvania's primary in presidential election years to make Pennsylvania's, to make sure that Pennsylvania has a bigger say in who the nominees are in the Democratic and Republican parties. So there's been a push for a couple different reasons. One, because of the religious holiday conflict. The other, to make Pennsylvania more relevant in the primary process. And legislation just made it out of the House to move it to April 2nd.
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to give you a break just for a minute because we're going to take a look at PCN's programming schedule. On the Issues has more candidates from next month's election for you to meet. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., we'll have Megan Martin, a Republican running for the state's Commonwealth Court. Then at 6:30, you'll meet Democrat Jack Piniella, who's running for retention on the state's Superior Court. Then on Thursday, Journalists Roundtable reports the latest news from Harrisburg. Linda Stein from the Delaware Valley Journal, Jillian McGoldrick from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Ryan Dito from the Pittsburgh Tribune Review will be our guests. That's Thursday at 6 p.m. During the month of October, PCN celebrates the 75th anniversary of cable television. Join us for interviews and panel discussions with the pioneers of cable. That's on Sundays at 8 p.m. with repeats on Thursdays at 7 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free on the internet. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Thank you. Now, Mr. Secretary, let's continue to talk about moving the presidential primary a little bit, just to get up to date on legislative action out there. So it hasn't gone through. The legislation has not gone through both chambers yet. The House has approved their bill that would move the primary. So currently the primary is on April 23rd. So what does their bill say about proposing a new date?
The bill that made it out of the House that's headed to the Senate is to move the primary to April 2nd. It's important, I think, that everyone, legislators and others, realize how time-sensitive all this is. The primary of 2024 may seem far away. We have another election just around the corner on November 7th, a very important election. Every election is important, but to elect a number of offices this November. But election administrators, like I mentioned earlier in our conversation, Larry, there's so much work that goes into preparation for Election Day. Thousands of polling places have to be secured. School districts that currently have off or scheduled to have off on April 23rd will need to have them off on April 2nd. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in the lead up to Election Day. So the sooner this matter is resolved, the better.
So I wonder if there's a hard deadline at this point, as far as you're concerned, Mr. Secretary, in order to put this into effect for 2024. And by the way, the legislation only affects 2024, doesn't it? It's not permanent.
It affects the primary of 2024.
Right.
And there was some legislation to permanently move it. There was some legislation to only temporarily move it. But again, the most important thing is that this really is a time-sensitive matter. So the sooner it gets resolved, the better.
Now, how can Pennsylvania justify, I'll say, having more influence in choosing our presidential nominee? I'm sure there are plenty of states out there that have similar aspirations.
Pennsylvania, in sort of every recent election in my memory, has been an important swing state. Sometimes it votes for Republicans for president. Sometimes it votes for Democrats for president. Sometimes we have Democratic or Republican governors, Democratic or Republican senators. There are some states that don't have that. They elect time and time again people from the same party to represent their state, whether it's at the federal level or governor or otherwise. Pennsylvania plays a very important role in elections, and I think it's important that Pennsylvanians make their voice heard when it comes to primaries for who the candidates would be in the Democratic and Republican Party.
Now, what's potentially confusing for the public at this point, if they happen to be following this issue, is that the House has passed this legislation that would move the primary to April 2nd, but the Senate might have their own ideas about a different date.
There was a date in a bill that came out of the Senate to move it to, I believe, March 19th. That did not make it out of the House back back to the Senate. But the Senate, as a co-equal branch, should make its voice heard as well to determine what their representatives think is best for their constituents. And I certainly can't speak for the Senate.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, you're keeping a close eye on that, I imagine, because it has all your resources have to fall in place in time for that.
That's right. And I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but it is so time sensitive. So we're hopeful that the matter will be resolved in short order.
And try to give us some more insight into what the counties then have to do, because there are just so many dominoes, it strikes me, that fall in one direction, and there may even be some unanticipated consequences. It's hard to figure it out, the whole thing in advance.
Right. Polling places, and my department had been involved with this for years, obviously, just like any other responsible for running elections, has to reserve those polling places well in advance to make sure that rec center is not being used for some sporting event that day that's election day, to make sure that church, community room is available on election day and not being used for a wedding reception or whatever else. So with thousands of polling places across the Commonwealth, it's important that election administrators have the time to reach out to the structures or organizations hosting that polling place on election day to make sure that other date is available. And
for the convenience of voters, it's nice to have continuity. In other words, have the same polling places from election to election.
That's right. There's continuity, and when an election moves, it's important that there be an election voter education campaign to make sure voters know when that election day is. Primary elections, as you know, are earlier than primaries in the other 3 years in a 4-year cycle. So instead of it being in May, it's in April. So that election day is already a little bit earlier. So it's important that voters know when election day is. Generally, with presidential elections, there's no hiding from an election coming up because of being bombarded with ads and all the rest. So voters will know what day election day is.
I wonder how flexible churches and rec centers and these other various buildings, just how flexible they are in their schedule. In other words, do they ever come to your department and say, you know what, no matter what, you can count on us being ready for the primary every year?
Absolutely. They're also not doing it for the money because they don't get paid very much to allow their facility to be used for election day. And there's no doubt that they're also doing it out of a sense of civic responsibility.
Secretary Schmidt, we're going to take a phone call, and this one is from Northampton. John, you're on PCN.
Hi, Mr. Schmidt. I live in Forks Township in Northampton County, and we have a school that holds the voting and a church. Now, I live on the school side of the township, but I refuse to go to the school to vote, so I go to the church because I'm afraid that if somebody calls in a bomb threat at the school, they lock it down and you can't get in to vote. That's not going to happen at a church. And at the church, when Obama ran and the crowd was big and we were getting cold outside, they brought us into the church and we sat at the pews and waited to vote. You can't do that in a school. I don't think schools should be in the voting process.
Well, John, really no voter should be afraid to show up and cast their vote on election day. It is completely unacceptable on any circumstances that voters would feel intimidated from casting their vote on election day and making their voice heard. As you know, in Pennsylvania, you are registered in your precinct. So you can only cast your vote on the voting machine or voting system or hand-marked paper ballot at the place and the precinct where you're registered. If you show up at a different precinct, then you would vote by, as you would know, something called a provisional ballot. It is a paper ballot that is included in a provisional ballot envelope so that the Board of Elections can scrutinize that to make sure that you are a registered voter. You might move from one building to another, and those buildings might be across the street from one another, but they might be in different precincts. And those precincts might be in a different election district with a different state representative or a different state senator or a different congressperson or whatever else. So the Board of Elections has to painstakingly review every provisional ballot to make sure that, one, if you're a registered voter, your vote gets counted, but 2, to make sure if you're not eligible to vote in that election district, that your vote isn't cast in that election district. If you move to a different precinct and cast your vote in a different precinct, and it's in a different state representative district, for example, you shouldn't have your vote counted for a representative who is not yours.
Thanks for that call, John, and I'd like to encourage others to call in. 1-877-PA6-5001 is the number to contact. And if you want to text us, text us at 717-219-4001. Mr. Secretary, let's talk about something else that has not gone through the legislature. In fact, the House has rejected the thing I'm about to talk about, but it strikes me as something that might come up again. This has to do with processing the mail-in ballots ahead of Election Day, and it's usually called pre-canvassing. And there was a lot of talk about that, a lot of excitement either, but again, the House has rejected this concept.
Pennsylvania is unique in that it does not allow the boards of elections to begin processing. It's not even the ballots. It's even processing the mail-in ballot envelopes. So,
meaning opening it.
Meaning reviewing the outside sufficiency of it and opening it and removing the secrecy and opening that and removing the ballot prior to 7 a.m. on election morning. There's organizing efforts that you can do prior to that. You can obviously see if a ballot hasn't been signed or dated prior to that. Many counties notify voters if they forget to sign or date it that their mail-in ballot won't be counted, so they can show up on Election Day and cast their vote by provisional ballot in many cases, or request a new replacement mail-in ballot and have that ballot cast and counted in time. But yeah, it's a
Is this something your office would support? Put it that way. Does it seem like a good idea to you?
Absolutely.
Pre-canvassing.
And red states do it, and blue states do it, and it's so frustrating looking up to a state like Florida for election administration, because Florida was the poster child for bad elections for a long time. But
right.
Florida's
Back
one
in
of the
2000, right?
Florida's one of those states that allows mail-in ballot pre-canvassing, where those envelopes are reviewed prior to Election Day. So on election morning, you can begin counting all of those ballots without the long assembly line that leads up to it, and reviewing secrecy envelopes and opening the envelopes and sort of all the rest. That's why in Florida, the results roughly around midnight. It would be the same thing, other than the ones that came in on Election Day. It would be the same thing in Pennsylvania if Pennsylvania allows mail-in ballot pre-canvassing. It seems like some mundane thing. It seems like it's some election administration kind of minor thing. But what it does, it results in mail-in ballot results being known earlier. And as we saw in 2020, there's a real vulnerability there in the amount of time between the polls close and knowing what the results are, where bad faith actors try to sort of discredit the election results. So when this, and I'm hopeful at some point that the Pennsylvania legislature will approve it and the governor will sign it, will, I think, help us know the results earlier, which I think everybody wants.
And so then under the current law, which does not allow this thing we're talking about, pre-canvassing and processing these mail-in ballots before Election Day, given the current law, then it takes time in order to tabulate the results. Now, of course, there was a time when we had results more or less instantly. Not the case anymore. And so under the current law, it seems like we got to get used to that.
That's right. When we only had absentee ballot voting in Pennsylvania, and let's say you had a handful of absentee ballots cast, every one of those that was a legitimate ballot that was returned in time and signed and dated by the voter and all the rest, they were counted. It was just that people knew the results on election night. If the winner and loser are separated by 20,000 votes and there's 5,000 absentee ballots, no one even bothered to sort of like stick around to go to observe that whole mundane process. But still, they were processed. When half your voters or a third of your voters vote by mail, conceivably every election seems close until those mail-in ballots are counted. But it absolutely helps improve voter access and election integrity because a voter is completing a hand-marked paper ballot.
Here's another voting issue that seems to flare up sporadically, I would say, and it has to do with voter ID. Now, current laws, you don't have to produce an ID unless it's the first time you're voting. So is there any talk about expanding voter ID?
There was some chatter again just a week or two ago with one of the bills to move the primary that included an additional voter ID component, as you mentioned, the first time you vote in Pennsylvania or the first time you vote at that precinct. You might move from one area to another.
Is that right?
It is. You have to show ID again. And there's a list of acceptable IDs to produce when you show up to vote. When you apply for a mail-in ballot, so that's in person. When you apply for a mail-in ballot, you have to include a driver's license number or a Social Security, the last four of your Social Security number on your application to establish your identity and your eligibility to receive a mail-in ballot if you're registered.
Let's talk about something referred to as the open primary. Now, it strikes me that it would interest your office because if it goes through, well, it would simply mean more work for your office. So just explain simply the concept of an open primary versus what we have now.
Right. Just to take a step back, Pennsylvania is what's called a closed primary state. So you have to be registered in a major party to vote in that major party's primary. So only registered Republicans can vote in the Republican primary. Only registered Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary. And if you are registered as an independent or non-affiliated or some other minor party, you don't get to vote in either party's primary. Open primaries, and they differ in different states for how they're sort of administered, would allow people to vote in primaries even if they're not registered in that party's, with that party affiliation. The administration hasn't taken a position on it yet. There's been legislation over the last couple of years to make Pennsylvania an open primary state, but the devil's always in the detail, so it's important to see what would be included for something like that to determine whether it's worth supporting or not.
So it sounds like, is there a patchwork of how primaries are handled in other states? And then that begs the question, why does Pennsylvania do it the way it does it? Yeah,
I mean, other states have clearly shown that it can be done. And some, if you're registered in a major party, can't vote in the other major party's primary. But if you're registered independent or non-affiliated or whatever, you could vote really in either. Only once, obviously, but to vote in either. So there's really different ways that this has been done in different states. But the public dollars pay for the administration of those elections. So there's an argument there that every voter should be able to have their voice heard.
Well, do you suppose an open primary can make it harder to build consensus for a major party?
I don't know. And I think, when you look at other states and how they've done it, they get administered in different ways. Each state has its own election code. Each state runs elections differently. In some states, for example, all voters vote by mail. And others are almost all in person except for absentee ballots. So there's so much difference from state to state. And I think it actually leads to a lot of confusion because there are 50 states running elections sort of 50 different ways, but all obviously following federal election laws.
So we've talked about a lot of different things here, Mr. Secretary. What other things are outstanding on your agenda as far as you're concerned?
I think, for your viewers who are really concerned about elections and concerned about our representative democracy, if they can, I would encourage them to reach out to the Board of Elections to determine if there are vacancies at their local polling place on Election Day, if there will be vacancies at their local polling place on Election Day, and to serve in that very important role. And it's gratifying. It's so important that on Election Day, it's not the Secretary of the Commonwealth who's the most important person for elections. It's not some county election administrator. It's the people from your neighborhood who are volunteering for 14 hours to make sure that your vote can be cast and counted.
And let's say some of those potential volunteers are watching us right now. Now's your chance to recruit some of those people. Go ahead.
I would say to reach out to your local election board. If you have the ability on Election Day in the primary and the general election, and you are committed to our republic and our representative democracy functioning the way that it should, to reach out to your election board to volunteer to serve in that really important purpose. It is, again, a long day, but it's gratifying to serve.
Our guest has been Al Schmidt, Secretary of the Commonwealth. Thank you very much, sir. PCN's John Cole talked to Mike Barley about skilled games in Pennsylvania.
To those who aren't familiar, what are skill games?
Yeah, so a skill game is it's a video game that requires skill, patience, dexterity to play, And really, when it comes down to the legal definition and why, there's a lot of confusion, it's just a gambling device. And the difference really is the way it's defined, the way gambling is defined in Pennsylvania and many other states is that it's simply consideration. You put money in a machine, you press a button, and you win or lose. It's dependent on some math equation that's in the game with a retention ratio. And then reward, you get something of value in return. Our game is different, and the courts have upheld this, that you do put something in the game of consideration. You press a button, but you have to play and interact with the game. Before you ever play the game, you can decide whether there's a winning combination or and you have to look and play the game. There's different combinations that come at you. There's different games. There's a Simon Says type game that comes to you. So, and then reward, you get something of value in return. In our games, it's cash. So that's really the difference. And that's the difference the courts see when it comes to the law. However, when you look at the game, again, you have to interact with it. In our game, you can win every time. You can win 105% of whatever you play, your play level every time. And that's the simple difference that really comes between our game and a video game terminal or a casino slot machine. And really, why our game has been so popular is players can win. They can win every time. If you're patient, and you play the game the way it's meant to be played, and you're really good at it, you can win every time.
So when did these skill games start in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the way Pace-O-Matic approached the state, before we ever placed a terminal in the state, and it's weird because we have a legal product. We know it's legal. Our attorneys believe it's legal, but we understand the complex nature of gaming in Pennsylvania. So we went to the state police, the Bureau of Liquor Control Enforcement. They looked at the game. They came back and said, we think this is a skill game, but we don't get to make those decisions. So we had a what they would term loosely a friendly pickup. So the law enforcement we put a game out in Beaver County. They seized it, took it to the court for declaratory judgment, and we won that declaratory judgment. The state decided not to challenge that ruling. So we then began going to each county, talking to district attorneys and others about the game and the law and the decision in Beaver County. And then really 2015 slowly started to build. And since then, obviously, we have about 18,000 terminals in the state, thousands of locations.
So specifically tell me, where are these terminals most common? Where do people most commonly play these skill games in Pennsylvania? Yeah,
it really varies around the state, and some of this will get into the regulatory part of this and how we're looking to change some of this. But in general, where we see them is in bars and restaurants, your fraternal clubs, your VFWs, American Legions, your volunteer fire halls, and convenience stores. Really, where we believe and what we're working in the legislature to do is to try to slim this down so it's in age-restricted places that still sell age-restricted products. And that's really where we believe they ought to be moving forward. And I think when we talk to the General Assembly and talk to the leaders there and the members, I think there's a general consensus that they believe that's where they belong and not really where you see them in these large halls with 80 games. That's something we don't do, but that is something that's growing, and it's a reason that we're really so forceful with trying to push a regulatory structure.
So 2 follow-up questions on that specific answer. One, what would the age that you think would be most appropriate that those would be able to play skill games? And 2, are you saying that currently right now, maybe not Pace-O-Matic, but are there skill games that are in places where in theory someone could be under the age of a certain where they shouldn't be able to do this? And are they at like gas stations, things of that nature, where it might be accessible to those who maybe are underage?
Well, look, I'll handle that in a couple of ways. Look, we are pushing, regulation. Currently, there's some legislation out there that marks it at 18. We'll see where that discussion lands. And look, the lottery's 18. There's a lot of discussion about 18 and 21. For us, we believe there needs to be an age restriction in place. So we'll leave that to the General Assembly to decide ultimately where that goes. But there's not only skill games in places where they probably shouldn't be, but there's also, honestly, illegal video game terminals in places they shouldn't be, because there's a lot of uncertainty with the law. And look, we've had to defend our game in the courts, and we've never lost a case. We've been successful in, almost 10 county Court of Common Pleas. We have a statewide court case coming up. And we feel we're going to be successful. These are appeals of successful cases we already have, but it's created uncertainty in the market. And I think for a law enforcement agent, it's difficult to tell what's the difference between our game and another game, or a real skill game and an illegal slot machine. So we believe that regulatory structure is going to help to make that much clearer for law enforcement and really take a number of these places that we see out there. As for underage gambling and or underage gaming and things of that nature, we want to have age-restricted places that are used to selling age-restricted products. They understand this. We often get the argument from, some in the casino industry that they're the sole arbiters of knowing how to handle underage gambling, but they've had many issues with that. And who's better than the local Pennsylvania business owner who has to do with selling alcohol and tobacco products? They know what's at stake. They know how to do this, and they're very capable of running this.
So final question, Mike, and again, just about a minute, if you don't mind, in your response. What's the latest on this in regards to the Pennsylvania General Assembly dealing with the matter?
Yeah, I mean, we feel like we've gotten some real movement. Recently had some hearings on this and the topic. And I think that there's a real understanding that the current situation is untenable. So we need to get this, the legislature needs to wrap their arms around this and start to, we believe, put some regulation in place. And we've offered, we want to pay an additional tax, which is not normal for an industry to come forward, but we understand the market and we're in, and we believe there is some interest in getting this done in this legislative term.
Mike Barley, Chief Public Affairs Officer for Pace-O-Matic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, John Cole. Here's a reminder about On the Issues tomorrow. At 6 p.m., we'll have Megan Martin, a Republican running for the state's Commonwealth Court. Then at 6:30, you'll meet Democrat Jack Piniella, who's running for retention on the state's Superior Court. That's it for Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.